The next item of business today is the members' business debate on motion number 6302 in the name of Richard Lyle on the 100th anniversary of World War I. This debate will be concluded without any questions being put, and I'd invite those members who wish to speak in the debate to please press the request to speak buttons now. I'd also invite those members leaving the chamber, and indeed those people leaving the public gallery, to do so quickly and quietly, please. I now call on Richard Lyle to open the debate. Mr. Lyle, 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I thank members for supporting this members' debate today? I first became interested in this subject as a boy. My grandfather fought in the war and his family preserved it through a publication, The Great War, by the Amalgamated Press, published after the war. The book, if you allow me, Presiding Officer, I have in my hand is a set of 12 that I have in my possession. Can I read the first page of this book? 10:25 Reuters. Germany declares war on Russia. St. Petersburg, August 1st. Germany ambassador, in the name of his government, handed it to the foreign minister in the declaration of war at 7:30 this evening. Reuters 10:27. Next year will mark 100 years since the beginning of this conflict, the day that people's lives, homes, attitudes and natures changed forever. Until 1939 and the atrocities of Adolf Hitler, the First World War was known as the World War or the Great War. Why? Because most of the casualties, fatalities, nations and people involved, the United Kingdom, France, Russia, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Serbia, Italy, Belgium, Australia, Canada, India, New Zealand, South Africa, United States, all of these nations and others were involved in the conflict. A truly world war. 70 million military personnel, 60 million of which were European, took part in the war. The war lasted 4 years, resulted in the loss of 16 million lives, 20 million people being wounded. 16 million lives, Presiding Officer. I feel that's important to stress. 16 million lives. That is more than 3 times the population of this country losing their lives at war. Of course, we here in Scotland played our part in the conflict, as well, with nearly 26% of our Scottish population, some 557,000 personnel dead or casualties, many of whom coming from my region of central Scotland and many other parts of Scotland, defending their country, protecting us all. In contrast, 11% of the British Army were casualties. This shows the part that Scotland played in this war. We could quite often be at risk of forgetting such a fact, but through the most important of memorial services and statues, acting as everlasting reminder that we should never forget the sacrifices made by many during the Great War. The reason behind the bloodshed and the loss of life is that over the course of these 4 terrible years, the nations involved made significant technological advances. Technology such as tanks, heavier guns, machine guns, flamethrowers, poison gas, airplanes able to bomb and strafe trench areas and behind the lines. Air war was in its infancy, but it was terrible. Aircraft carriers and heavy battleships and submarines. Members, I'm sure, have listened to that list will naturally note that some, if not all, of these weapons are still in use today in our modern armies. At this point, can I also highlight the high loss of life in our naval forces during the war, particularly in the Battle of Jutland. Many ships were sunk, in particular HMS Invincible. Yes, I will.
John Mason.
The member makes the point that one of the reasons for the loss of life was the advance in technology. How does the member feel about the claim that there was also a disdain on the part of some officers for the number of ordinary people that lost their lives?
Richard Lyle.
There was a fact during that time that it was felt you could attack a position, and some officers actually were 26 miles behind the lines, and I agree with the comment made by the member. I spoke earlier of the effects of the Great War had, and I intend to highlight specifically what I mean by this. And even Lord's study of war since the 1400s, he stated the First World War transformed traditional attitudes toward war. For the first time, there was almost a universal sense that the deliberate launching of a war could no longer be justified. Commemoration, Presiding Officer, the honouring or preservation of a memory of an event or a person, never has a word been more fitting than that. To honour and to preserve. Never again should we stand back and allow ourselves to be involved in such a war, such bloodshed. The men and women of our armed forces who lost their lives in the war and others since deserve to be remembered next year and their memories preserved. In light of this, Presiding Officer, I have been approached by a constituent, a Mr Ian Thompson, who is keen to erect a memorial in mainland France to recognise the sacrifice of all Scottish forces who fought in the liberation of Europe in World War I, both women and men. I am keen to generate support for this project, as it has been brought to my attention that no such monument exists within mainland France. There are memorials that commemorate individual Scottish regiments, and I pay tribute to them, and not one that takes in the whole of the work done by the Scottish Armed Forces. I believe that this is an oversight and it should be corrected. Mr Thompson has recently visited and been in contact with officials, and in particular the mayor in the French town of Arras, as we hope to position the memorial near the town. This is where most Scottish regiments were involved in the battle that took place around Arras. We intend to establish a group to take this forward and enlist the help, and hopefully the help of the Scottish people and the Scottish Government. There were many battles fought all over France, too numerous to mention: Arras, Ypres, the Somme, Passchendaele, but we also have to remember battlefields in Italy, Russia and Africa. All the personnel who died during this conflict should have a place in our heart. It is my sincere hope, with the 100th anniversary of the Great War approaching, that the people of Scotland will take time to remember the sacrifice their countrymen and countrywomen made to ensure that they could live in freedom. I also note that with no remaining combat veterans from World War I, that we do not become complacent and forget those, the great people, the great men and women, what they did for us. It is important never to forget, so we do not repeat the mistakes from the past. In closing, I would like to thank Mr Thompson for all his hard work in bringing this to my attention and asking the Scottish Government what events, and I ask the Scottish Government what events are planned for next year to honour all the personnel who gave all their freedom nearly 100 years ago. In closing, Presiding Officer, can I repeat, with your permission, the immortal words: at the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them.
Thank you very much. Now call on Jim Eadie, to be followed by Hanzala Malik.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I would like to congratulate my friend and colleague Richard-Lyle for securing this important and timely debate on the 100th anniversary of the First World War. The war memorials which grace our cities, our towns and our villages testify to the sacrifice made by so many young men who went off to fight in foreign fields, never to return to their native land. We should all welcome the emphasis placed on restoring these memorials in this anniversary year, and I'm glad that the Scottish Government is helping to honour the memory of all those who fought in the war, and particularly those young men who lost their lives or were injured. Tens of thousands of men died in the trenches and are now buried in the fields of northern France and of Flanders, casualties of the war that was meant to end all wars. And Richard-Lyle told us eloquently about the huge loss of life. And here in Scotland, we are reminded by the historian Richard Finlay of the sacrifice that they made. Over half of all men between the ages of 18 and 45 took part in the war. That is a colossal number of people. But of course, behind every statistic lay a human story. A family torn apart by the loss of a loved one cut down in their prime. A father killed in battle who left behind a widow and young children, or a son lost in conflict. The impact of the war on families and communities was shattering, with an incalculable cost and impact on those affected. So we all have a duty to honour and remember the service of those who laid down their lives, but not only that, we have an obligation to preserve this history so that future generations will never forget. There are a number of ways in which we can do this. One way in which we can do this is through the preservation of sites of international importance that tell the war story. I'm grateful to the Edinburgh Evening News for its campaign to preserve the site where thousands of soldiers in Edinburgh and across Lothian are prepared and trained for life in the trenches. My constituent, war veteran and inveterate fundraiser Tom Gilzane said recently, "These trenches at Dreghorn are a monument to the sacrifice of millions and should be kept for posterity and are a monument to the men who served in them." We can all agree with the words of Tom Gilzane. I have in my own constituency another important part of the story of World War I. Napier University bought the former Craiglockhart College of Education in 1984. This site was requisitioned by the military during the First World War for use as a hospital, but it was also a very significant centre for the treatment of shell-shocked servicemen. And it was here in 1917 that the poets Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon first met. At this location, some of Owen's and Sassoon's greatest war poetry was inspired and written, and the resulting friendship was to have a significant and lasting impact on English literature and our view of the war. I'm fortunate to have the War Poets collection housed today in my own constituency at Napier University, a lasting and fitting legacy to these war poets, and one with a powerful message which resonates still today. And as we remember the tremendous sacrifice and service of these men, we should also remember the role played by women. I would like to recognise in particular the hard work of my constituent Ian McFarlane in his efforts to ensure suitable recognition for Dr Elsie Ingalls, a war surgeon who set up volunteer hospital units staffed entirely by women who treated over 300,000 wounded Allied servicemen. Mr McFarlane has worked tirelessly to honour their memory and has been successful in securing funding to stage an exhibition in this Parliament in honour of these remarkable women, an exhibition which will feature the paintings of one of Scotland's greatest living artists, John Bellamy. All of these examples, Presiding Officer, demonstrate how we continue to remember those who served in the war. They remind us of an important period in our history, one we must never forget and one we must never repeat. The last words should be with Wilfred Owen, who reminds us of the horrors of war. He said, "My friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory the old lie, dulce et decorum est, pro patria mori."
Thanks very much. Now call on Hanzala Malik to be followed by Kenneth Gibson.
Good afternoon and thank you, Presiding Officer. First, I thank Richard-Lyle for securing today's debate. Thank you very much for securing that. I'm honoured to be able to speak today on the upcoming 100th anniversary of the First World War next year. Scotland had the largest proportion of volunteers estimates in the UK with 300,000 recruits. It has been estimated that Scotland lost more men per head of the population than any other warring nation, with the exception of Serbia and Turkey. While Scotland made a significant contribution in men, women and materials to the war effort, it is estimated that we do not forget the soldiers from the Commonwealth who were heavily involved as well. Glasgow is hosting the Commonwealth Games on the 100th anniversary year, it is even more important that we take a moment to consider the people from Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and the Indian subcontinent who fought and died in large numbers. In particular, 1.5 million volunteers came from the Indian subcontinent, particularly from the Commonwealth group of nations, who won some 13,000 medals with their involvement in the war. It is also important to include Sipahi Khudadad, that means soldier Khudadad, from the Punjab, now in Pakistan, in our thoughts, who was one of the first out of 12 men from the Indian subcontinent to receive the Victoria Cross during the First World War. I also want to ask that we remember the 55,000 men and women from the African subcontinent and colonies, British Empire, who served, and the 10,000 who were killed or who died during that war effort. We sometimes forget the horrors of war. It is something that we need to ensure that we learn from. I am an ex-territorial soldier. I used to be in the Royal Engineers. And I can assure you that I and many others who had practical experience, unlike myself, do not wish to see war repeated. War is a horrible and a very evil amongst the human race. Therefore, every effort needs to be made to ensure that all efforts are made to resolve issues around the world via dialogue rather than war. Because war leaves a lot of innocent people in particular who lose loved ones, and not only that, but a lot of innocent civilians die out of the war. And we see it even today in places like Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, and possibly now in Syria. Therefore, I think that dialogue is very important. We need to support our politicians to ensure they do that. But lastly and not least, I want to make sure that we in our schools ensure that our children are aware of our history, past and present, and also that they are made aware of the horrors of war and the positive actions that can be gained by dialogue and talking to people. Therefore, whilst I'm grateful for bringing the motion to us here today, I think when it comes to memorials, I'm saddened to learn that we don't have one in Scotland. And I think that we should have one in Scotland that recognizes all the contributions all our serving men, women and children have made throughout history for us. And if we can perhaps do that, I have no problem in supporting the French effort. But I think we should have something in Scotland so that we can mark it annually and we can actually attract and learn from our past history. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I call on Kenneth Gibson to be followed by Alex Johnston.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I too congratulate Richard-Lyle for securing this important debate. The Great War undoubtedly changed the social, economic and political fabric of our nation. It was like nothing Scotland or any nation had experienced before. The magnitude of the conflict, scale of the slaughter and mechanised precision was completely new. The war also reached home in a way it had never had before, and the idea of the home front was born. Volunteers streamed to the colours at the declaration of war, but the buoyant mood wasn't to last long as a horrible reality dawned and entire communities began losing brothers, fathers and sons in huge numbers. Scotland suffered appalling and horrendously disproportionate losses, sustaining 147,609 fatalities and 410,000 wounded, more than Australia, Canada and New Zealand combined, from the 490,000 Scots who served in the British Army. A casualty rate of 81%, and as Zalam Malik pointed out, only Serbia and Turkey suffered a high proportion of military casualties. Richard made Scotland's sacrifice clear. Our losses represented 19% of the British war dead at a time when Scotland had less than 9.5% of Britain's population, while tens of thousands of other Scots perished serving valiantly in the London Scottish, Liverpool Scottish, Australian, Canadian, New Zealand, South African and other regiments raised throughout the Empire. Every community in Scotland and countless Scottish families suffered grievously. My own maternal grandfather was gassed at the age of 18 a week before the armistice and died of emphysema at the age of only 41. My paternal grandfather served in the Highland Light Infantry, one of only 2 men of 110 in his company who joined in 1914 to survive physically unscathed, although one can only imagine the psychological scars he and so many others from that ruined generation suffered. Presiding Officer, I want to focus on the sacrifice of just one family. I believe few families endured as much as the Mockery family of Kilbirnie, the town where I live in my Ayrshire constituency. The Mockery family had 5 brothers serving in the British Army, 3 of whom, 19-year-old Private Robert Mockery of the Royal Scots Fusiliers, 21-year-old Private Matthew Mockery of the Cameronians and 28-year-old Corporal James Mockery of the Gordon Highlanders were all tragically killed on the first day of the Battle of Lewes on 25th of September 1915, along with many thousands of their compatriots. There was no Scottish equivalent of Saving Private Ryan, and their brother, 36-year-old Private Andrew Mockery, also of the Cameronians, was killed at the Battle of Arras on 9th of June 1917. John Mockery of the Nottinghamshire and Derbyshire Regiment survived the conflict, as did his sister Euphemia, a nurse with the Army Auxiliary Corps. Her son William McKim was tragically killed serving on HMS Hood in the Second World War. and the McKim family still lives in Kilburnie. In Scotland, we are to some extent still suffering not just from the human losses, but the Spanish flu, which also killed many hundreds of thousands of people across the UK and Europe, and also from the economic consequences of the Great War. In the aftermath, Scotland, which had been a bustling workshop of shipbuilding, railway manufacture, munitions, coal and steel during the war, was left with a huge overcapacity in each. Economic dislocation, recession, unemployment and poverty in the 1920s left to almost 10% of our population emigrating overseas and thousands more moving south in the decade following the armistice. It's hard to comprehend the suffering of those who fought and their loved ones anxiously waiting at home during the conflict and the crisis of confidence that struck Scotland after that war was over. Many of us are the descendants both of those who bravely fought and died for their country and those lucky enough to return home, often maimed and traumatised to an uncertain future. It is, as Richard-Lyle so poignantly pointed out, our solemn duty to remember them and to commemorate their sacrifices which were made for all of us. The impact of the First World War in Scotland is very hard to comprehend and engage, but the war certainly changed Scotland and the world forever.
Many thanks. Now call on Alex Johnston, after which we'll move to the closing speech from the Minister.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I would also like to take the opportunity, as others have done, to offer a particular thanks to Richard-Lyle for bringing this issue before Parliament. In fact, with the anniversary so near now, I'm sure this will not be the last time that we discuss issues revolving around this 100th anniversary. In fact, in 1915, I'm aware that troops in the trenches were encouraged to look back across the previous century to the culmination of the Peninsular War with the Battle of Waterloo. Next year, we ourselves will look back over that 100-year gap and commemorate the bravery and sacrifice of those who willingly took up arms in defence of their country. It's perhaps impossible for us to truly comprehend the horrors of the Great War. Wilfred Owen has been quoted in this debate already, but he it was who described World War I as the winter of the world. The sacrifices of our forefathers, which he described so eloquently, are our shared heritage, and the 2014 centenary, which will be commemorated around the world, will be a particularly poignant reminder of just how much we owe to a generation who where too often the personal hopes and aspirations of young men ended in the stinking mud of France and Flanders. It's vital that we don't allow the scale of the brutality of this war to fade from memory. And that's why it's important that our young people play a key role in the commemoration. Visiting a battlefield or a war cemetery can be a deeply moving experience, and I very much welcome the fact that the UK Government has already announced plans to commemorate this historic centenary on the 4th of August 2014, including a flagship scheme to give thousands of school children the opportunity to visit the Great War battlefields, as well as a £50 million fund to help support community events. I also welcome the very comprehensive 5-year commemoration announced by the Scottish Government, which was specially created by the distinguished members of the Scottish Commemorations Panel, which is led by former Army Chaplain Norman Drummond. The funding announced by the First Minister, which is targeted at refurbishing community war memorials and supporting secondary schools to carry out educational visits to battlefields of the Western Front, is also to be commended. There can be little doubt that as our young people visit the graves of the fallen and read the names and ages on the gravestones, it will not be lost on them, as it's not lost on anyone, how very young these soldiers were when they lost their lives. Ultimately, I believe it's our own communities who will lead the way in these commemorations, and I very much look forward to taking part in these activities and reflecting on those who, in the words that appear in many a war memorial, gave their todays so that we might enjoy our tomorrows. There is one aspect of the debate that's taken place today which I feel I cannot allow to pass without making some comment. It is very true that the line that the troops in the First World War were lions led by donkeys. However, the suggestion that all the officers were hiding some distance away is one which would not be an accurate reflection of the history and the facts of the First World War. It is true that those who guided... let me complete my remarks, please. It is true that those who guided the conflict on a large scale were often in a protected position, but it is also the case that thousands of young officers led their troops from the front and were themselves victims. And another great war poet, Siegfried Sassoon, was in fact one who gave his life in service of his country. So let's not dwell upon any class differences that may be hidden within this history. Let's remember all the courageous young men who gave their lives in northern France and Flanders, and who did so that we might enjoy our freedoms.
Many thanks. Now call on Cabinet Secretary Fiona Hislop, 7 minutes, please.
Presiding Officer, I would like to congratulate Richard-Lyle for securing this members' debate and for the excellent speeches that we've heard. The motion concludes with the words, "By commemorating the war, we will remember them." It is clear from the points made today that we are all committed to ensuring that the sacrifice of so many people is truly respected and recognised. The First World War was truly global in its impact, involving the major powers and their colonies in fighting across fronts in Western and Eastern Europe, Gallipoli, Palestine, Mesopotamia, Africa and the Far East. The First World War claimed the lives of over 16 million people across the globe. Richard-Lyle reflected the scale. Alec Johnson reflected on the youth of many who died. Of the 16 million, almost 1 million British lives were lost. Scottish communities bore tremendous losses, and it's been estimated that over a quarter of all Scots who fought in the First World War were killed. Out of 10 Scottish regiments, it was estimated that Scotland lost about 100,000 men out of a total British total of 745,000 losses. We must never forget our long and distinguished military history. I'm proud to be attending the West Lothian Armed Forces Day in Livingston on Saturday to recognise the debt that we owe to our service personnel. Remembrance is a key feature of our commemorations for the First World War. In March, I appointed the Scottish Commemorations Panel to advise on how we mark the centenary of the war in Scotland. The First Minister announced on the 23rd of May the key dates for Scottish commemoration, endorsing recommendations from the panel. The dates mark significant Scottish military involvement and tragic domestic incidents. The tone adopted for commemoration will be crucial. Our commemorations, especially those marking the centenary of the outbreak, must be sensitively handled and be relevant to all parts of Scotland and the Scots diaspora. Scotland's programme will align with that of the UK Government. It is fitting that the UK-wide commemorations will begin on the morning of the 4th of August 2014 in Glasgow. There will be a special service for Commonwealth leaders at Glasgow Cathedral, followed by a wreath-laying service at the city's cenotaph, and Hans Alan Malik referred to the Commonwealth relationship. The following weekend, Scotland will mark the outbreak of the war with a drumhead service in Edinburgh, a multi-faith service which will replicate services conducted on the front line, where neatly piled drums draped with flags were used in place of a religious altar. More details about the service and indeed all the events planned will follow in due course. There will be 4 key dates recognising Scotland's significant military contribution. Scotland will remember those who stood alongside our Anzac comrades at Gallipoli on the 25th of April 2015. On 25th of September 2015, we will turn our attention to what historians refer to as Scotland's battle, the Battle of Lewes. 30,000 Scots served and made up half of all casualties, and I think it was very appropriate that Kenny Gibson referred to the Mockery family of Kilbirnie and their loss in very personal and human terms. On the 31st of May 2015, we will commemorate the Battle of Jutland. Although Britain lost more ships and men, Germany never again seriously challenged British control of the North Sea during the war. And on 9th of April 2017, we will focus on the Battle of Arras, which saw the largest concentration of Scots to have fought together during the war. And our commemorations will also remember 2 domestic incidents to reflect the broad impact of the war on Scotland. 22nd of May 2015 will see commemorations for the train crash at Quintus Hill near Gretna. The Leith-based 7th Battalion Royal Scots Territorial Force were on their way to Liverpool for Gallipoli and lost 214 officers and men. 246 people, mainly soldiers, were injured, and this still remains the worst British rail disaster. Scotland will also mark the loss of the HMI Alair on New Year's Day 2019. The Alair was carrying many naval personnel returning home to Lewis from the Kyle of Lochalsh when she struck rocks half a mile from Stornoway, with a loss of 204 of the 285 men on board. And the end of the war will, of course, be marked in November 2018, and this will reflect on the sacrifice of those who fought, lost loved ones, and those whose lives were changed forever by the nature of war. And one of the objectives of the commemoration is to reflect on the domestic impact of the war in Scotland. Our commemorations will allow for a spirit of open inquiry as we seek to understand and remember, for example, the role of women, highlighted by Jim Eadie, and those people who disagreed with the war, and a range of social impacts the war had on all of our lives. We will not just commemorate the First World War with national events. The First Minister announced on the 14th of January the establishment of a £1 million fund to enable war memorials to be restored. There are over 5,000 war memorials in virtually every village and community across Scotland, and this fund will help us bring our memorials up to standard and ensure that they are at the heart of our four-year commemorations as we remember the sacrifice made by our local communities. I was delighted to learn recently that the Commonwealth War Graves Commission planned to restore 12 graves in Motherwell's Globe Cemetery, which of course is part of Mr Lyle's constituency area. And I would encourage support for public subscription for the new memorials, such as the one proposed for Arras, which was referred to by Mr Lyle. Education will be a key focus for our commemorations, and indeed.
Thank you very much. I too agree with the Minister that there are many memorials around Scotland, and particularly I'm very proud to see them in small villages or where regiments were based at one time or another historically. What I would like, however, is one singular point for all of our losses in Scotland. I think that would be a great gesture for our men and women and children who lost their lives. It's something to consider.
And I would encourage Sinzala Malik to visit our Scottish National War Memorial at Edinburgh Castle. Education will be a key focus of our commemorations, and that is why the First Minister announced that fund for battlefields. And of course, in terms of visits, he announced on 20th of May £1 million for every secondary school in Scotland to be available to them, to allow a subsidy of £2,000 per school to enable 20,000 students to visit the First World War battlefields during the next 6 years. And it is vital that we help the next generation to understand and to explain to their friends the true significance of the conflict for Scotland and the wider world. Across Scotland, there are a range of activities planned to support the centenary, and it is right that these are happening independently so that our local communities feel free to commemorate as they see fit and in very personal ways. There are a wide range of exhibitions planned, school projects around a huge amount of activity to support genealogy and the sharing of family and community histories. And the University of Edinburgh will tomorrow launch their virtual history archive, Scotland's War, which will provide an important resource. There is no shortage of fine work being carried out to create a fitting legacy from the centenary. I'm pleased also that the Heritage Lottery Fund has recently launched its Centenary Grants programme, enabling communities to explore their First World War heritage and to deepen their understanding of the impact of the conflict. Presiding Officer, I'm sure this Parliament will revisit the commemorations in years to come. It is our responsibility and it is our duty to remember, and Presiding Officer, we will remember them.
Well done. Many thanks, and I now suspend this meeting until 2:15.